Hi, everybody. Welcome back here. We'll be starting panel 2 here shortly, titled Culture, Art, and Migration. And for that, I would like to introduce you to your moderator, Clint Burnham. Clint Burnham is a professor and graduate chair in the Department of English here at Simon Fraser University. He lives and teaches on the traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam nations. Clint's research interests include cultural studies, especially film and popular culture, contemporary poetry, and theory, especially psychoanalysis and Marxism. With that, I will turn things over to Clint here.
Great, thanks, James. It's all going through. It's okay. Yeah, I'm really excited to be moderating this panel, to be taking part in this very important conference in however small a way, and especially because the members of this panel, Steve Collis, Alessandro Capradani, are both longtime friends and comrades of mine. People I have a lot of respect for, and Roia is a student working with me for the past couple of years, so who I also have a lot of respect for, and so it's really quite fabulous to be part of this project, as I said, in however small a way. I'll just read a brief bio for Steve Collis and let him get started. Stephen Collis is professor in the Department of English at SFU. He's the author of many books of poetry, including The Commons from Talon in 2008, On the Material, Talon in 2010, which was awarded the BC Book Prize for Poetry, Decomp with Jordan Scott from Coach House in 2013, and Once in Blockadia from Talon Books in 2016, nominated for the George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature. He's written 2 books of literary criticism, a book of essays on the Occupy movement, and a novel. His Almost Islands is a memoir that came out, I think, 2 years ago now. It's quite amazing. And he's working on a long poem, sketch of a poem I will not have written. Steve's talk is called Walker's Tales, Mobility as Method.
Thanks, Clint. Thanks, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, and let's hope that works because this is my first time doing this. So hopefully some will let me know if you do not see this slideshow.
It's good. It's good, Steve.
That's fine. Thanks. In the summer of 2015, I was invited to contribute to a project called the Refugee Tales and to come to the UK to join a week-long walk from Dover to Gatwick, and so between 2 detention centers in the company of refugees, asylum seekers, and former immigration detainees. In that summer, images of overloaded boats sinking in the Mediterranean seemed to be in the news almost daily. And when I arrived in the UK, I soon met several men who had indeed themselves been plucked from the sea by the Italian Navy. Their stories and the trauma they were freighted with became one part of a growing friendship. We've spent a week together for 5 summers and have visited on other occasions as well. They are more than their dramatic and traumatic stories. They are human in a way that is difficult to put into words. Humans that seem to have a surplus of humanity, more real, more present, more vulnerably who and what they are, more open to encounter. Humans with much of the social clutter and coding cast aside. They have been blown open, I suppose, by trauma and displacement. I do not want to fetishize the refugees' experience or participate in any sort of trauma porn. I simply want to note that their humanity exceeds our attempts to humanize them, just as their stories largely exhaust the capacity of storytelling. In fact, and perhaps counterintuitively, I think the attempts to humanize those who have been, as we so often hear, dehumanized, could in fact be part of the problem. In March of this year, I was due to fly to Milan for meetings as part of an international research project on human movement. From there, I intended to travel on to Venice for a few days. As it turned out, Northern Italy in March 2020 was not ideal. In the Venice I did not visit, in the sudden absence of self-isolating human beings, images of dolphins sporting in the now clear canals were soon circulating on the internet. One also might have stumbled upon a viral image of elephants, supposedly drunk on corn wine and passed out in a tea garden in Yunnan, China, on a bender in the absence of lockdown human beings. The images of the dolphins, it turned out, were not of Venice. The veracity of the inebriated elephants is still not confirmed. But the collision of the human and non-human at the outbreak of the pandemic is instructive. When we feel ourselves stumbling, we imagine other species ready to step in and fill the vacuum. Is this fear of our dissolution into a world that is more than merely human, or a desire for the same? I would argue that our crises are in some ways always crises of the relationship between the human and the non-human. It is hard to avoid seeing the discourse of human rights with its universal aspirations as largely a failure. Each attempt to expand and defend the category of the human is predicated upon a border maintained between the human and what the human is defined against. And just as in the case with the geopolitical border between nations, the conceptual border between the human and non-human is a privilege for some, while it is the very matrix of the suffering for others. I feel it is necessary to look beyond the human for the good of the human. What I find myself searching for when considering the refugee question is an ecology of human movement embedded in what French gardener and philosopher Gilles Clément describes as a planetary garden, formed of the collaborative wanderings of a wide range of species. I can only offer speculative forays into this topic here. When I see my friend Osman each year in the UK, it is summer and we are walking, and one of the first things I will notice is a sprig of lavender tucked in his hat, as you can see actually on both sides of his hat here. Osman has trouble sleeping, and the oils of lavandula are known for their general relaxing effect. Its name perhaps comes from the Latin lavar, to wash. The Romans and Greeks used lavender in baths, and the Egyptians perfumed corpses with it in the embalming process. In 1629, herbalist John Parkinson recommended lavender for, quote, all griefs and pains of the head and brain, end quote. Indigenous to the Mediterranean coasts and East Africa, growing from the Canary Islands to the Arabian and African borders of the Red Sea, I wonder if the scent of lavender also reminds Osman of his home in Eritrea. His entire journey from Africa across the Mediterranean to Europe was a walk through lavender's spreading biome. Cyprian Broodbank, in The Making of the Middle Sea, suggests that after the last glacial maximum, plants burst from the refugia to retake the Mediterranean basin, describing an overall trend of expansion from the southeast to the northwest. Plants are migrants. Animals, including human beings, follow those plants or follow the animals following those plants. Domestication, Brookbank writes, quote, marked the final stage in a coevolution of plants and people, end quote. I scale out to see my friend walking in the early years of the past decade, southeast to northwest, through Libya and Italy and France to the UK, in the company of a plant that he seems to have found a nearly symbiotic relationship with. In Cardiff, where Osman now lives, he has planted lavender along the fence outside the refugee center where he works. And these thousands of kilometers away, I plant lavender along a new path I had built during my own pandemic lockdown. I think what I'm after is a form and geography of human movement that is as old as humanity itself, but which does not separate human from other species related movements and their shared push and pull factors. Which is to say, I'm trying to imagine the kind of human movement that today leads to declarations of a migrant crisis, a flood of humanity, not as an extraordinary situation, but as a situation that is definitive of who and what our and many other species have always been. The only extraordinary thing is how fundamentally a walker the human being is. And shifting scales, again, the escalating hostility being imposed on an environment of mobility, grim border restrictions, cruel immigration policies, and the extreme irony of former colonial powers complaining about the traffic coming north after they have so often been barging their way south. Somewhere in the middle of this particular picture is the Mediterranean, a historical crossroads. Somewhere in the middle are seas of water and seas of sand, and a terrible will to turn them into impassable walls where they have so often been bridges. Somewhere in the middle is a mobile and particular ecosystem. We forget, or perhaps overlook or ignore, repress, and disallow that the Mediterranean is as much an African sea as it is a European one. French historian Fernand Braudel writes, quote, "Mediterranean history has felt the pull of its desert pole as well as of its European pole," end quote. Tectonically, Africa moves 2 centimeters closer to Europe with each year. No papers will be required. No immigration policy can stop a continent. Saharan desert sometimes falls as red rain in southern Europe. In The Conscript, the Eritrean novelist Gebrselassie Haile describes a journey from Massawa in Eritrea to Libya. Quote, "At nighttime on a ship, it doesn't look like the ship is sailing. It feels like the land is moving away," end quote. Hailu's The Conscript, the first novel in the literary history of Eritrea, written in Tigrinya in 1927, tells the story of a young Eritrean who was conscripted by the Italians to fight a colonial war in Libya. The main character, Tukwabo, notes the irony of, quote, "fighting for those who came to colonize and to make others tools of colonizing African neighbors," end quote. Tukwabo, who eventually returns home brokenhearted, describes his shock at how different and foreboding Libya appears. Quote, "The view of the desert was overwhelming. There was not a tree or blade of grass, and the desert was an expanse like the sea, but a more hostile one," end quote. Lavender is endemic to the borderlands of the desert, patrolling the seam between these 2 seas, native to the shrinking gap between Africa and Europe, an inhabitant of the border. Osman crossed the 2 hostile seas lavender divides through Libya and then across the narrow straits to Italy. But it was a crossing made even more hostile by a new exploitive market in human trafficking and new regimes of border security. Everywhere I turn, I look for connection, to find that entangled world where one being cannot be separated from another. Because when we do disentangle, we too often create categories and hierarchies. Haile is instructive. There is the truth of entanglement seen in Tukwabo's love of the immersive rhythmic motion, as he calls it, of a remembered mule ride, smoothly floating on the plains like water running on the ground, his being riveted by the sudden movement of flying birds. And at sea in the Mediterranean, even the dolphins, he writes, seem to be singing songs of welcome and farewell. The world is alive and the human being is directly entangled with and implicated in it. But then there are those who would use this deep connection as an excuse to cut loose part of the human community. The Eritreans in Hailu's story are confined by the Italians to the ship's deck with, quote, "no shelter from the sun's heat, a place where you put animals," end quote. It is perhaps the most common point of comparison for anyone who has ever been cut from the human fold, the comparison to the treatment or station of animals. Osman himself, on his time in Italy, writes, "I was a stray dog among humans." Still others whose tales I have heard speak of being treated, quote, "as if I were a poisonous snake or an infectious animal," end quote. Quote, "we were locked in the cage as though we were wild animals." Quote, "the security guard shouted at us like we were just animals," end quote. The problem of the mistreatment of human beings as though they were animals runs up against the fact that human beings are animals and need today, above all else, to return to the company of the living earth. But this is a difficult thing to say when right now so many are held in pens, chased off into foreboding wastes, and shown not even the slightest kindness, courtesy, or care. It is also a problematic thing, it's worth noting, to be said by a person like myself, white, deeply privileged, descendant of colonial settlers who themselves used the category of the animal to displace those whose lands they invaded. And yet I can't help but think, as long as we guard the border between the human and the non-human, some human beings will be forced across that border into the other category when it suits. As Carrie Wolf writes, quote, as long as it is institutionally taken for granted that it is all right to systematically exploit and kill non-human animals simply because of their species, then the humanist discourse of species will always be available for use by some humans against other humans as well, to countenance violence against the social other of whatever species or gender or race or class or sexual difference, end quote. Before I run out of time and room, I need to say something about the Planetary Garden. Gilles Clément argues against distinctions between indigenous and invasive species, calling, quote, for more involved forms of responsibility and for collaboration with the global wanderings of species rather than bioregional control, end quote. The Planetary Garden refers to the fact that all species are mobile, at least and especially when viewed over long timescales, changing latitudes and altitudes with the changing climate, but also that the particular mobility of the human being has reshuffled the distribution of life on the planet as perhaps nothing has before. This also creates for Clément an opportunity, quote, to work with rather than against the powerful flux of life, end quote, provoking him to imagine a kind of utopian ecology, quote, where all of life together, including humanity, interacts without borders, end quote. Darwin himself, in immunologist Pierre Sonigo's words, saw the history of life as an adventure where the subject does not designate an isolated individual, but heterogeneous populations of agents with entangled interests. The border, mobility, and entangled interests. The question of the contemporary drama of human mobility is not far from Clément's mind, and decidedly an aspect of his Planetary Garden. He asks, quote, what will become if strangers take our ground, end quote. Mobile plants are vagabonds in Clément's nomenclature, and they decamp to abandoned zones that he calls undocumented tracts. Clément translator Jonathan Skinner connects the dots. Quote, to cultivate the Planetary Garden is to aid forces that would undermine, circumvent, and ultimately tear down a formidable wall between the economic north and south, the wall that girds the developing carbon economy, end quote. Elsewhere, I have called the entangled interests embodied in the Planetary Garden the biotariat, where once capitalism was understood to be more or less exclusively the extraction of surplus value from the labor power of human beings, whose historical mission it was to realize their exploitation as a class, the proletariat, and rise up as such to seize the means of production from the exploiting bourgeoisie. Today, in the era of geophysical capitalism, we see that the entire biosphere is now captured in and subject to the global process of the production of surplus value. This new stage of capitalism, therefore, calls a new revolutionary subject into being, this subject that I call the biotariat, the agency we may yet find in the state of exception exploited and excluded human beings share with all other forms of exploited life. Where the Planetary Garden suggests a cultivation of relationships between mobile humans and non-human communities, the biotariat heralds a more militant form of interspecies solidarity and agency. We must rise with the non-human, for the long history of attempts to rise from and away from the non-human, to separate ourselves via our supposed exceptionalism, is littered with failures. The concept of human rights is by and large one of these failures, for as a discourse, it trips over the border it continues to reinstate between the human and the non-human. Attempts to propose rights of Mother Earth are one signal that human rights alone have not been enough to preserve our persistence on the planet. A short coda. During the Great Plague of London in the 1660s, lavender was being sold on almost every corner and worn as a protection from infection. I write these words amidst another time of plague, a plague made worse by its intersecting with other ostracisms, other forms of forcibly imposed social distancing. It's widely believed that the pandemic has everything to do with the dysfunctional relationship to the natural world that has so characterized contemporary global capitalism. I think the same holds true for human movement. As a species, we have survived by going places. just as most other species and animals that can move have moved when they've had to. I wonder what plants will scent our passage through this difficult time. What range of other species, mobile across the face of the earth, will we find as traveling companions? As whispering dream scents we can sleep within. I ask this question from my invasive lavender bed, while I think of Osman amongst his equally invasive lavender outside a Cardiff refugee center named Oasis. Thank you. Stop share. Okay, out of there?
Great, yes. Thanks, Steve. Next up is Alessandra Capradani. Alessandra is a lecturer in the Department of Humanities at Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary literature and culture, theory, psychoanalysis, and translation studies. She is particularly interested in examining how literary and cultural texts register, problematize, and critique social and economic determinants, how they orient us toward our world, how they address embodiment and materiality, and how they contribute to the production of social links with human and other than human worlds. Her work has appeared in articles and book chapters on poetics, avant-garde studies, translation and culture, feminist writings, animal studies, and psychoanalysis. Alessandra's talk is titled Speech Acts in Search of a Subject, From Victimization to Enunciation in Recent Immigrants' Life Writing in Italy.
We're now all acquainted with the intensification of migration flows into Europe, especially the often fatal crossings of the Mediterranean and equally dangerous routes through southeastern Europe. The mediatization of the conditions of these passages, which are meant sometimes to stay, sometimes to move on, has catapulted the question of migration flows into Europe at the forefront of global attention. Images of floating dead bodies, overloaded boats, confrontations between NGOs, ships, and policing authorities, or overwhelmed hotspots have become the rule, more so through European news channel, of course, than global ones. But at this point in history, no one has failed to hear about Lampedusa or Lesbos or Malta. Yet the contingency that we are facing is hardly new. Despite the differences in the circumstances that individual countries had to face, the numbers of people attempting their fortune at entering the old continent has been steadily on the rise since the 1980s. What is new instead is the global reach of the imagery connected to such flows. In this paper, I'm not interested in giving a summary of the political economy of migration through Southern Europe, the main port of entry for the majority of migrant routes, or a sociological explanation of the migratory phenomenon. What I'm interested in addressing instead is the discourse around migration, a discourse which has congealed around the notion of a crisis. Crisis is a tricky term and one which has become the commonplace descriptor of the political, social, and cultural conditions that characterize our present moment. A moment which is seemingly read as starting with the exceptional circumstances of the opening of the century, September 11, 2001, only to be followed by another series of crises at the economic, financial, and international political level. What does the discourse of crisis do? How does it frame the problem, since the problem is doubtless in place? And what possible solutions does it envision? The fact that in the current climate, the discourse of crisis has been attached in the public sphere primarily to the challenging problematics of migration begs for some analysis. The mediatization of the rising number of immigrants from Africa and Asia and the Mediterranean, primarily toward the countries of Italy, Spain, Malta, and Greece, has engendered a discourse of crisis that foregrounds displacement, racialization, destitution, and exclusion. These issues are real and call for urgent responses, an urgency which the politics of the European Union has failed to address in pragmatic ways with near disastrous consequences. For example, by refusing to resign or at least modify the Accord of Dublin imposed on Southern European countries through economic and financial leverage, or by refusing a repartition of migrants amongst all the countries member of the European Union. Many countries from Eastern Europe, for example, simply refuse to do so altogether, but even apparently virtuous countries do so only nominally. They show to accept migrants and refugee claimants only to reject their application of refugee status once they are in Germany, with the consequence that the applicants are sent back to the original port of entry. And this is what happened, ironically, to many migrants from Africa at the same time that refugees from Syria were accepted in a grand gesture of benevolence on the part of Angela Merkel. But the maneuverings of national politics, which best resemble a game of chess, cannot be seen only as a product of geopolitics. The discourse about migrants is now evidently in place. The question is not so much or not only how to rescue such discourse from the appropriations of what are called, in my view, not quite properly, the populist rights all across Europe, but rather questioning what a crisis as a term reveals about political discourse and what it does in terms of solution. So far, the discourse of crisis has been complicit, if not essential, to the construction of the image of the migrant as necessarily and only victim. The most obvious consequences of this gesture are threefold. First, the migrant is deprived of a voice and altogether of subjectivity, at least in the eyes of the general public in reluctantly hosting countries. Such deprivation does not allow for a genuine encounter between different parties, the host and the guest, with all the contamination, imbrication, and subversion that these terms imply, as Jacques Derrida has well demonstrated in Hospitality. In fact, it positions the migrant uniquely as object of political action rather than subject. While such a victimhood is also real and should be understood in relation to failed post-colonial politics, neoliberalism, and the crisis of global capital, it is met with the resistance and hostility every time the typology of the victim is not met. And here I come to the second consequence. What happens, for example, when immigrants are not fleeing from wars, when they're not destitute, or when they challenge the liberal structures of European nations through patriarchy, for example. Framing the migrant as victim gives a fodder in the hands of right-wing groups when the social tension explodes. Is the migrant robber, rapist, terrorist a victim any more than any national robber, rapist, or terrorist? Obviously, I'm not implying that migrants are identified with these positions, but the criminal acts, just like patriarchies, do not stop at the border. This is just a fact. And whatever the circumstances that give rise to such actions, every criminal act entails its own sociological explanation, they are bound to have a social resentment explode. But crisis, and this is the third and most problematic consequence, also deprives us of political imaginaries, forcing us into a deadlock from which we can hardly find any way of escape. Language freezes reality, which we can attempt to manage, so as we manage a crisis, but without really envisioning solutions. And yet it is only through language, through speech acts, that we can hope to imagine and work for different realities when we are pushed in a corner. At the moment, even critiques of global capitalism and neoliberal discourse risk becoming empty gestures if used only as the scapegoat explanations of the current conditions. And I'm obviously talking about public discourse and not a specialized scholarship. In this whole framework, what about the migrants themselves? How do they position themselves toward a broad-based benevolent humanitarianism that frames their position as victims? I've been following for several years the representation of migrant issues in the country of Italy, where I come from, in terms of representation in the media, in politics, but also in written works by migrants. I've never engaged in formal interviews or the kind of work in situ that, for example, Steve Collis does, although informal conversations with migrants have happened. But I'm interested here in addressing the written word, which is bound to perform not an immediate, but certainly a more enduring intervention. I've previously worked on the early so-called migrant literature in Italy, which emerges in the mid-late 80s when the presence of West African and especially Senegalese migrants became visible. Previous waves of migration were more scant and less visible for different reasons that I don't have time to address here. They started primarily as collaborations with the journalists and brought into the public autobiographical narratives of the migrant experience in realist style. As the genre matured, they were followed by the first works of fiction of the diaspora, struggling to reconcile mixed identities and positionalities. They were paralleled by different artistic works by Italian or mixed race artists that problematized the then prevailing notion of fluid borders, showing that the Mediterranean is hardly fluid anymore. And for example, I'm thinking here of the installation of the visual artist Stefano Boeri, The Solid Sea, a study of the Mediterranean, which was exhibited at the Documenta in Kassel in Germany in 2002. These works are interesting not only for the details that they provide of the migrant experience, but also as a first attempt at self-articulation within a rhetorical space that did not leave much room for voice. However, despite the fact that these narratives were attempting to locate the protagonists onto the discursive map of Italy as speaking subjects, they were easily absorbable into a rhetoric of victimhood and well-meaning subjecthood, the good guy who manages to get integrated into the normal, in quotation marks, society. In the last couple of years, instead, a veritable wealth of material has made its appearance on the literary market. Many of these works are collaborations between the migrant subject and journalist mediators. Lack of accessibility to a command of the language would otherwise make the writing impossible. On the one hand, we obviously need to remember how the mediator, so the journalist, intervenes in the shaping of the narrative and choice of words, and therefore co-produces the work itself. I think in similar fashion to what Sophie McCall describes in relation to indigenous people and ethnographers when the encounter is one of collaboration rather than cultural theft. Caution here is therefore to be exercised in reading these works, and even more so when the migrant is the interviewee and the journalist controls the story. On the other hand, not all works are the product of collaboration. Some, a few at least, come from migrants who have already been rebuilding their lives in Italy for some time and who have become confident enough for the act of writing. Two works of this vast production, which honestly surprised me in terms of sheer size, are Abubakar Sumaro's Umanità in rivolta, la nostra lotta per il lavoro e il diritto alla felicità, Humanity in Revolt, Our Fight for Work and the Right to Happiness, published in 2019. And Francesca Manocchi's, who is the journalist, Io Khaled vedo uomini, sono innocente, I Khaled send men and I am innocent, also published in 2018. Abubakar Sumaro is Italo-Ivorian, 38 years old, with a degree in sociology. He's a trade union activist, and this is his first book. What is striking in Sumaro's narrative is not only the simplicity of style and the ability of rendering a complex experience in a straightforward language, conveying a sense of immediacy for the reader, but also, and above all, the way in which his experience is analyzed in terms of economic and political analysis at the global level. While Sumaro emphasizes questions of racialization, racism, institutional exclusion, economic struggles, and social prejudice, that is the specific condition of the migrant from Africa, He immediately situates these coordinates, which he has lived in the first person, in relation to the operations of neoliberal politics and global capitalism. The condition of the African migrant subject occupies the center stage in this narrative, but it is not detached from all other determinants that constitute a social order at large. In this way, the author makes apparent the connection between the rage of groups enacting the demands of the populist right and the condition of the migrant, rather than resorting to claims about identity, which is never put in question by the subject itself. And every migrant I talk to, identity is not really an issue. Soumahoro reads the specific conjunctions traversed by and imposed to the migrant subject as a leverage against the positionality of workers altogether. The problem then is not one of natives versus migrants, but of capital against the workers, and the complicity of those institutional forces, not necessarily all forces, but enough to produce a damage in maintaining the status quo. The subordination of workers to capital, furthermore, does not begin with entering Europe, but with the very promise of capitalism. The opening of the book explains how it was his move for study purposes from his village in the Ivory Coast to the economic capital of the country that is confronted with the elegant and broad boulevard of the plateau, the business district, the pomp of its palaces, the luxury of its shops, the large cars, and the elegant pedestrians. So hardly images that we would connect to Africa, even in our own racism. Hard work was to be the route to the achievement of such a dream. And the seasonal work in the rural areas of southern Italy was the first step. But such a dream does not exist. It is nothing but the phantasm of the real. You won't have access to the luxurious world of the plateau, well guarded by its own interests. In the same way that the idea of the migrants invading Italy and stealing our jobs is also a phantasm of the real. First of all, because there are no jobs to be stolen in the first place. The depletion of the working class is now an accepted phenomenon, unfortunately, except in the underground economy, as the author discovers at his own expenses. But by showing the structural connection between these and other only apparently dissimilar problematics, the author produces a critical intervention in the current and facile approach to the question of migration. Without advocating revolutions or rageful acts, Soumahoro articulates the notion of humanity in revolt as the legitimate fight for work and, above all, the right to be happy, a notion that he adopts from the US Constitution. In so doing, he positions himself as a subject of enunciation, a subjectivity which is about the right to work and the right to be happy rather than about being the object of suffering, although the narrative contains plentiful moments of enraging dispossession and abuse. This position makes possible collaboration toward a common goal. His final call for action is a warning. If we let ourselves be pushed in a corner, all agency is lost. But the route out is always analysis and understanding that punctures the fantasy of facile humanitarianism. The second book, which I'm going to address even more briefly for lack of time, is worth mentioning for the particular position of the protagonist, Khaled, who tells his story to the journalist author of the book, Francesca Manocchi. Narrated in the first person, this is the story of a young man of about 30 years old from Libya. He participates to the revolution and the deposition of Gaddafi. But the revolution, as it often happens with the revolutions, betrays him. The particularity of the story is that Khaled, whose dream was to work as an engineer, decides not to leave. He observes the progressive collapse of his country into confusion and disarray, civil war and worsening corruption. The reasons for his refusal to leave are never quite stated, but seem to be linked to the hopelessness which he identifies in migration itself, perhaps conscious, as Zizek would say, that Norway does not exist. Khaled is a trafficker of black migrants, sometimes of Libyans too. He handles his clients as merchandise, who has willingly agreed to become cargo. He observes the many instances of corruption and violence around him with a sharp eye, but minimal emotion. He participates sometimes to this violence, which seems inevitable. But his position is itself contradictory, neither victimizer, he does not force anybody, and people would be willing to cross anyways, or victimized. Even the multitude of migrants caught into the traffic do not come across as victims. Most of them do not have to flee. They're not running away from wars, and sometimes not even from economic destitution, but they want to be happy. And this is the striking question that each one of them seems to ask of Khaled. Please help me, I want to be happy. Khaled instead has decided to stay behind. And at times we suspect this is not only because of the lucrative business, but because of the task that he has taken upon himself. And there could be a whole psychoanalytical reading that one could give. He will be the one facilitating either death or happiness. Either way, this is their choice. Once again, through a detailed and sharp analysis of conditions that stretch well beyond the confines of Libya, Khaled exposes the structures that implicate state, capital, and class, and the complexity of class relations in different African countries in shaping the current situation. And while announcing himself as the trafficker of humans, he also asserts his contradictory innocence. This is a difficult book to read, but at the same time, giving a different perspective of life within a state of violence, and surprisingly, not one of victimhood. Neither Khaled nor his clients claim the position of the victim. Instead, the narrator assumes the full burden of his responsibility while exposing the structure of a system that sustains his actions. It is this assumption that situates the narrator as a subject of enunciation. And subject of enunciation means a subject of political action and political rights. I'm going to conclude now to leave more room for discussion, but the question that I would like to pose is, who is really served in the depiction of victimhood, which currently dominates public discourse, especially in Europe? Does it really serve the fragile condition of the migrant? Is what Zizek calls a fetishistic disavowal that speaks more to the guilt of the past a viable mean to address a different future? In short, is the crisis a migrant crisis or a crisis of ideas and fundamentally paralysis of politics? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alessandra. Our third and final paper for this afternoon session, or whatever time of the day it is where you are listening to this, is by Rowiya Inaim. Rowiya is a PhD student in the Department of English at Simon Fraser University. Her current research project approaches the Palestinian-Israeli context through a psychoanalytic and cultural studies lens. Specifically, she is exploring how individual and group fantasies are embedded in cultural objects that reproduce this occupation. Her most recent work is a book review of Greg Burris's The Palestinian Idea, Film, Media, and Radical Imagination, which will appear in the November issue of the journal Continental Thought and Theory. The title of Rowiya's paper is Inherited Memories, Fetishistic and Fantastic Misrememberings of Palestine. And please remember to stick around afterwards for the discussion. Take it away, Rowiya.
Thank you. Since the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, and the 1967 Neksa, or setback, one of the fundamental political and cultural concerns for Palestinians is the right of return. That is, the right of Palestinian refugees, exiles, and victims of other forms of forced migration to return to their homes in Palestine from which they were expelled. For the most part, Palestinian refugees and exiles have not been granted permission to return to their homes, and consequently, much of the current inquiries into the Palestinian trauma of dislocation is concerned with the catastrophic circumstances that caused their expulsion and with the difficulty of the journey to, as well as the uneasy feeling of not belonging in, the country of refuge. What is often neglected as a topic of critical discussion in the Palestinian context, however, is how trauma is realized upon the refugee or immigrant's return to their homeland, when such returns are permitted. In this paper, I observe and evaluate 3 models of returning to Palestine and study their impact on the traumatic memory of dislocation and dispossession. These models include a fetishistic return, a fantastic return, and a traversed return to Palestine. I call the first of these 3 models of return fetishistic because of its incomplete and suspended return to Palestine. There are 2 main ways by which this model of return is expressed culturally. First, the Palestinian key of return and its ability to symbolize the Palestinian right of return in particular, but also the Palestinian struggle for freedom at large. And second, the Great March of Return protests. In the midst of the chaos of the events of the 1948 Nakba, which resulted in the destruction of just over 500 Palestinian villages, the massacre of hundreds of Palestinians, and the expulsion of nearly 700,000 others, Palestinians gathered whatever belongings they could, locked their homes, and fled to safety. With them, the Palestinian refugees held their house keys, not thinking of their flight as anything but temporary. Over 7 decades have passed since the Nakba, however, and these keys that once opened the doors to Palestinian homes have been made redundant. The locks have been changed, and so have the inhabitants of the homes. Yet, Palestinian refugees, whether internally displaced within Israel proper, in refugee camps in the West Bank, or neighboring Arab countries, or elsewhere in the world, still hold on to these keys and pass them down intergenerationally. Along with inheriting the key, new generations of Palestinians inherit the memory of Palestine and the Nakba, but also, as Scott Webster puts it, inherit exile itself. Now, these large metal antique keys are replicated and reproduced in Palestinian artwork, such as in the cartoons of Naji Al-Ali, which you see on the screen, as souvenirs, as home decorations, and are even printed on graphic t-shirts. In the repeated act of inheriting this key intergenerationally, as well as producing this key artistically and commercially, Palestinians return to the Palestine that existed in the moments just before the catastrophe of 1948, through the key's ability to symbolize and engender the idea that this displacement is meant to be temporary. In this sense, the key of return functions as a fetish in the Zizekian sense, referring to the mechanism by which an individual accepts a given trauma, yet simultaneously disavows it. Here, the fetish helps the individual to cope with their devastation. To illustrate his conceptualization of the fetish, Zizek gives the example of a man who is able to cope with his wife's passing by repeatedly stroking the pet hamster she left behind. And by doing so, he suspends his encounter with the devastation of her passing, even though he acknowledges that she is dead. Functioning in a way that is similar to the key of return and Zizek's concept of the fetish, the Palestinian Great March of Return allows for a similar incomplete and suspended return to Palestine. The Great March of Return refers to a series of protests that took place in Gaza from 2018 to 2019, where thousands of Palestinians repeatedly marched towards the Israel-Gaza border to express their demand to return to their homes in what is now Israel. While both the keys and the marches help to keep the memory of the Nakba alive and to preserve the insistence on the Palestinian right of return, this model of returning to Palestine and its repetitive quality poses a threat of perpetual incompletion. In other words, by repeatedly enacting the suspended return to Palestine, there arises a potential danger of sublimation, in the psychoanalytic sense, where the act of repetition through inheriting or reproducing the keys and marching is elevated to the status of return itself. In other words, the danger of this model of return is in the potential of satisfaction that can be experienced through this repetition that can distract from the goal of a fulfilling return to Palestine. The second of these models involves returning to an idea or fantasy of Palestine. In the film Salt of the Sea, directed by Anne-Marie Jasser, the protagonist, Soraya, who's an American-born Brooklynite and a descendant of grandparents exiled in 1948, obtains a temporary visa, and returns to Palestine in hopes of recovering funds remaining in her grandfather's bank account before fleeing to Lebanon. Despite her efforts to obtain the funds, Suraya's demand is denied by the bank. At this time, Suraya is also unsuccessful in renewing the 2-week visa that she was originally granted by Israel, nor is she able to obtain a Palestinian ID card or passport. Regardless of whatever authentic documents she was able to produce to prove that she is both the rightful inheritor of her grandfather's money and a Palestinian, Suraya is constantly told that there is nothing that they can do for her. She is told that despite her authentic documents, she cannot get the ID or the money because both Palestine and the bank branch that held her grandfather's money ceased to exist in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. Yet whenever the fact of the Nakba is pointed out and explained to her, whether by the bank managers or the ID card agent, Suraya stares blankly at the men in front of her and re-presents her documents and reasserts that her grandfather was born in Palestine. Suraya's adamance in the face of the bank manager's patient explanation of why he cannot release the funds to her is mistaken for theatrics, an act, unnecessary drama. Yet while we as viewers can see that Suraya is indeed serious in her attempt to regain the money, we can read her inability to acknowledge the consequences of a Nakba as symptomatic of the fantastic version of Palestine that she has constructed for herself. For Suraya, the Palestine to which she is returning is not the occupied Bantu-stantic Palestine that is still suffering through the ongoing Nakba, but rather the idyllic orange grove-filled Palestine that existed just before 1948. This fantasy is perhaps most evident in a scene between Suraya and a character named Imad, a descendant of refugees who fled from the village of El Dawaima to Ramallah during the Nakba. Imad's right there in the scene, just to the right. In the scene, Imad drives Suraya to a hilltop and points towards the horizon, showing her the coastal city of Jaffa, and behind it, the Mediterranean. Suddenly, Suraya begins to narrate memories of Jaffa, and she says, "My grandfather swam in that sea every morning. Then he'd walk on Al Hilwa Street to reach Al Tawfiqiyya Library, then onto Al Nuzha Street. Cars weren't allowed on Al Nuzha. The orange traders, Jaffa oranges, met at El Salahi Market. My grandfather always talked about Al Madfa Cafe. Kulthum sang there and Farida al-Atrash. Those are popular Egyptian singers. My grandmother really loved Farid. Sometimes my grandparents went to the cinema, the Hamra cinema. When they were broke, they'd wait by the side door and the doorman would sneak everyone in." Suraya narrates these memories with such impeccable detail. She can tell us the names of the library, the cinema, the cafe, the market. She can tell us the names of the streets, describe the route from the sea to the market, and can even recall city bylaws banning cars from El Nuzha Street. At the end of this monologue, Suraya asks Imad if he has ever been there, to Jaffa, to which he responds by asking her if she is sure that she hasn't been there herself, referring to her detailed and seamless description that she offers. Of course, Suraya has never been to Jaffa, nor has her father, and so the memories that she narrates are that of her grandparents, which she inherited. Later in the movie, Suraya manages to successfully rob the bank of her grandfather's money, gets into Israel by disguising herself as a Jewish settler, and makes her way to her grandfather's house in Jaffa, where she meets the Israeli woman, Irit, that now inhabits this house. Suraya walks into the house and looks around, observing its walls, its windows, its floors, when she turns to Irit and asks her, "What happened to all the furniture?" Not just as a question, but also there's an element of expectation or assumption that the furniture would still be there. When Irit tells her that her family must have gotten rid of it, the screen immediately cuts to Suraya vomiting by the ocean. In another scene, Suraya tries to buy her grandfather's house from Irit, but is again told that the state would not allow it because she is not Jewish. In the final scene of the movie, Suraya is about to be deported back to America, and when she is asked where she is born, she tells the agents that she was born here in Jaffa instead of New York. The combination of Suraya's retelling of her grandparents' memories, her attempt to regain her father's house and money, and her changing of her birthplace to her grandfather's indicates that she identifies with her grandparents, mainly her grandfather, and constitutes her own desires and being in the very possessions and way of life that they lost. Soraya even experiences a repetition, or at least a version of, the Nakba, when she is deported from the very place from which her parents were expelled half a century ago. Additionally, we can see that this identification and the fantasy that she has constructed allows her to make sense of her identity, as well as helps her to protect her from the ontological lack that is caused by the Nakba. Soraya is an American citizen, but is not satisfied because she knows that she is also Palestinian. Yet she cannot document her Palestinian identity in a way that satisfies the requirements to obtain a Palestinian passport or ID card because her parents and grandparents are refugees. Nor is she able to transcend her Palestinianness, or rather non-Jewishness, in a way that would allow her to buy her grandfather's house. The only identity that Soraya can perceive of as being complete and not complicated is that of her grandparents before the Nakba. Then we can think of Soraya's return to this Palestine, the Palestine of her grandparents, as fulfilling their desire to return to Palestine and reconnect with their possessions. However, the limitations of such a version of return are glaring. Since Soraya's idea of justice is an individual and particular one, limited to obtaining a number of material possessions, the money in the house, she does not extend her version of justice to her she does not extend her version of justice or her model of return to the rest of the refugees or anyone else for that matter. Comparably, the last model of return, which I describe as performing a sort of traversal, also contains an element of fantasy. In his poetic autobiographical narrative, When I Saw Ramallah, Mourid Barghouti returns to Palestine in 1996 after a 30-year exile. Barghouti's book begins with his description of the moment he returned to Palestine, with the hours that he spent at the Israel-Jordan border. After making his way through the border, Barghouti is disenchanted by the dusty scenery around him, as he writes, "I used to tell my Egyptian friends at university that Palestine was green and covered with trees and shrubs and wild flowers. What are these hills bare and chalky? Had I been lying to people then? Or has Israel changed the route to the bridge and exchanged it for this dull road that I do not remember ever seeing in my childhood? Did I paint for strangers an ideal picture of Palestine because I had lost it?" Here, Barghouti confronts his fantasy of Palestine as an Edenic, elusive promised land, which he constructed to make sense of his loss, the loss he experienced when he was exiled. Compared to Soraya, who is criticized by Ahmad for thinking that Palestine is, quote, just oranges, that is, reducing Palestine to an essential set of idealistic characteristics, Barghouti confronts his own retreat behind a fantasy, thereby traversing it and redefining his subjectivity. Barghouti continues to walk himself through this traversal as he writes, "I ask myself, what is so special about it except that we have lost it? It is a land like any land. We sing for it only so that we may remember the humiliation of having had it taken from us. Our song is not for some sacred thing of the past, but for our current self-respect that is violated anew every day by the occupation." In her article, Rethinking Palestinian Exile, Inherent Loss and the Object of Desire in Mourid Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah, Shada Abu Awad Shaheen breaks down this passage and highlights the significance of Barghouti's traversal. She writes, "Upon return, Barghouti realizes that the Palestine of memory, the outer shell of the kernel, is what they have fundamentally enjoyed. It is not the physicality of Palestine that they want, but the fantasy of it. The Palestine, or the land of the poem they have been fantasizing about in songs, narratives, and political slogans is but, to quote Lacan, an object that is nowhere articulated. It is a lost object, but paradoxically, an object that was never there in the first place to be lost." Throughout this narrative, Barghouti attributes a sense of permanence to exile, and even critiques the sense of particularity or uniqueness that an exile may experience. He even compares it to asthma at one point. That is, if you're exiled once, then you will always be in exile. Instead, Barghouti is not content or satisfied by the physical return to Palestine, as he tells us that even after his return, his life is still controlled by the Israeli occupation. Rather, he insists on not returning, that is, not to return to a fantasy of Palestine, nor to a fantastic sense of a complete identity, but to remain perpetually exiled in his realization of his universality. By way of closing, I want to return to Abu Awad Shaheen's article, particularly her idea that Barghouti represents a quote, perfect universal subject in his ability to see beyond the particularities of identity and to acknowledge that displacements cannot be cured by anything, not even the homeland. By accepting the permanent state of exile, his eyes refuse to naturalize the, quote, different degrees of contentment and of acceptance of exceptional circumstances, imposed on the exilic and disposable subject by the unjust global system that victimizes disposable groups like the Palestinians and places them in Olympic races for victimization with their oppressors. And it is in this rejection of particularity in favor of universality where the revolutionary potential of Barghouti's model of unturn lies. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Roia. Thanks, Alessandra. Thanks, Steve. Some great ideas there in dialogue and maybe in antagonisms as well. So that's really wonderful to see such a spectrum of things happening. I want to see just to see if there are any questions. Either, I guess people can put their hand up. I guess I'll go to gallery and see what is happening there, or in the chat. And of course, I have some in my back pocket because these are my friends, and they get me thinking when they're talking. Okay, all right, I'm gonna do one. You know, I was just to bring Steve and Roia together. First of all, I was thinking about the walking and the images of walking, and there was the cartoon that Roia showed of the guy walking through the keyholes, and also the walking towards the border of the reenactment. And then the walking that that Steve and his friends have been doing for 5 years now, is that right? Since 2015. Mm-hmm. And perhaps the walking in and I don't know. I mean, I like to ask you to put them into dialogue with each other, and what kind of walking is happening there. What are the intentions? What are the effects or affects? Yeah, that's it.
I think we can both answer, Ralia. Do you have something you want to jump in with?
Sure. So the walking, particularly for the reenactment in the Gaza protests. So in the Nakba itself, the main way of fleeing was walking. So you have a lot of these haunting images and videos of hundreds of Palestinians walking towards either Jordan or Lebanon or Syria. So that walking is very much a direct allusion to the walking in the Nakba, for sure.
That's fascinating. It's both a repetition of a historical, like a performance or re-performance of a historical flight, but it's also through a desire to return or a protest against the inability to return. And the walking that I'm engaged with people is not in the name of a return. These are people who cannot return because they fled to save their lives. If they returned, they would forfeit their lives still. So the walking is celebrating the necessity of moving away sometimes. Unfortunately, the geopolitical necessity of moving away from where you were and finding somewhere new to be. Yeah, that's a start of a conversation. I'm not sure where we go with that, but they're fascinating mirrors of each other in some way. And Rauli, do you know the book The Return by Hisham Matar?
No.
It's a more recent book. He's Libyan, but I think I haven't read the Barghouti book, but I think they would have a fascinating conversation. mean, it comes 20 years after. I'm sure Matar must have read that book too. But he fled Libya as a child, fleeing Gaddafi. And then after 2011, he goes back to try and find his father, who had stayed in Libya and was missing. So there's that unfindable object at the heart of the story too.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm gonna look it up.
You can see why Saeed would have blurbed the Barghouti book, because to me, he's all about being in exile, the universality of exile. There was a question from Dimitris Kralis.
Hello, thank you for really interesting papers. I would like to start with Stephen's invocation of a planet and of a physical world that is in movement and produces a natural, if you wish, kind of sense that there's always been that kind of movement, and take also the notion of crisis that Alessandra invoked, and also the suspicion that emerges from the discussion, which is understandable, of this invocation of borders and barriers, a suspicion which I completely understand if I were to go to Lesbos, where I originally am, and I see a landscape that is completely the same from either side of the straits, and then how there is a border. But at the same time, to bring forward a very recent kind of Canadian experience and Canadian discourse on the border with the United States in the context of another crisis, a pandemic crisis, and how we're all kind of very happy to be in our homeland, on our side of the border, away from the barbarians in the south, who are not only pandemically dangerous, but also they could give us their virus of politics. And I wonder ultimately, what are the conditions under which we authorize ourselves to invoke a border or break a border? And I want to give you a bit of a context for that. I mean, I'm a new Canadian, and of course, I see the United States in the South. I'm also a bit of an eco-pessimist. I see a complete dustpolization of the Southern United States and ecological catastrophe. At some point, we will be faced as Canadians rich in an empty country to invite or accept, because they have the bayonets, more people coming in. So where does the line exist, if one does exist, for drawing a border, especially when that border might, in the Canadian experience, you could say, have a lot to do, the future imagined dystopian experience, might have a lot to do about what right-wingers invoke, the preservation of our way of life, and so on and so forth. I don't know whether this makes sense, but it's an agony I have when I think about these things, because I want
Maybe we'll let them answer the question, if that's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Dimitris. Thank you.
I've been talking too much.
No, but I Sandra, if you want to start, but Dimitris, there's such a, it's so complicated and fascinating, multifaceted, that it's hard not to get carried away. I heard one American say that who lives in Canada. He said, living in Canada right now is a little bit like living in a nice apartment, but downstairs is a crack house.
It's a good imagery. But I think that the discourse has become polarized between those who invoke a sealed border and those who instead invoke a complete openness. And I find the idea of complete openness untenable, simply untenable. I don't think that it can possibly exist. You would open up a can of worms in so many different areas of life. The use of weapons, for example, would be one. Do I want in my country people going around with a gun in their hands? No, I don't. So in the end, from the moment that you have some sort of institutionalization, there is also a concretization in limits and seals of some kind. However, we don't have to conceptualize the idea of borders in this complete set and closed way, as it has become the case in the last decade. I think that there has been a particular shift starting in the 90s when borders have become militarized and guarded in a very particular fashion. Even at a time in which there was not a European Union, but it was simply a European market. So you had the borders, you needed to present documents and everything. But there was flexibility nonetheless in the way in which people were coming and going. One of the things, for example, that has happened in the 1990s is that any program for labor migration has been interrupted. Lots of people from North Africa were more than happy to come for a certain season or for certain jobs for some time, but keep their homes, keep their land and going back on a regular basis. And this is very, very possible. We assume that everybody who wants to come comes from such a dire existence that they want to run away, obliterate what was before, and they want to settle down among us. This is not the experience that I hear about. People love their countries. People love their countries and love their land and would like to see some change. And giving more mobility for coming and going, even if it is under some sort of institutionalization. Obviously, visas would need to be admitted and it has some kind of control, but would allow so much more integration between cultures, economies, labor forces, that is not perfect, but definitely would open up something. Whereas at the moment, if you're African, you want to work in Europe, you can't. There is no way. I mean, you can go to the embassy and ask for a visa, but it does not exist as a possibility. So in the end, it is our closure that has produced the necessity for some people in order to come only through certain means. And this is untenable. And with the integration of economies in the whole global world, it has become an explosive bomb. So to some extent, I think that the crisis of migration has been produced by the politics of Europe, precisely how it came into being from the 1990s on, and not the reverse. It's not that they started coming. They've always been coming. They've always been around, but they have been around in a different way. And this logic has created really a binaristic mentality that is very difficult now to shift without immediately exploding a whole series of affect and fantastic imaginaries. The first is they are stealing other jobs. There are no jobs because the factories are no longer there. It is a deindustrialized country now. Factories are elsewhere. They have been delocalized, accepted the situation. So let's talk about the whole picture if we really want to talk about picture, but the time of the blue-collar working class in which I was born and grew up and very familiar with is no longer there, unfortunately. So there is nothing to be stolen in the first place.
Steve, do you want to talk a bit, and then we have 3 more questions coming in.
Well, I'll try to be really brief about the original question by Dimitris. I'll step around the pandemic question. I think that's about controlling the spread of the virus, and the border is a convenient tool that was already there to play around with that, I suppose. There's some complexity there, but as far as climate change, yeah, the only hope is that we find some way of redistributing the human species on the surface of the planet. That's going to have to happen, or it won't. And it's catastrophic. And the thing standing in the way is the nation state. It's the problem in terms of human rights. It's the problem in terms of climate agreements, and why the UN cannot make a useful or functional climate agreement is because of its mandate to protect sovereign state rights. The nation state's a big issue there. And just quickly, just going to add on to what Alessandro was saying, the people that are making their way all the way through Italy, because yeah, you're right. I know so many people have come through Italy, could not, obviously they can't get work, they're destitute, they're eating out of dumpsters and sleeping in the streets in Italy. They head on to England. A lot of these guys have anyway. In England, the hope is, and some succeed in getting some sort of, getting a asylum, a refugee status, and then you're able to work. But I think, Alessandra, you're so right to focus on the work component here. The work part of this is huge. And then what work are former refugees who wind up achieving asylum, and many don't, but the ones who do, what are they doing right now in the pandemic? All the guys I know are delivering food in London. They're like whatever those things are called, like Uber Eats or whatever. But they're buzzing around the city on scooters, or they're riding the subways. Everyone on the subway system is a non-white person doing the crappy service work for next to no money, because like Alessandra said, the old-fashioned working class jobs are gone.
Okay, so the next question is from Sergio Basso. Can you turn your camera on, if that's possible? Great, thanks. Can't hear you.
My fault. Now you can hear me, right?
Yep.
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Sinaim. Could you tell us something more about the Palestinian community in British Columbia? What's its take about the 1948 crisis, about the Nakba?
The Palestinian community in British Columbia is very, very small. The main Palestinian community would be in Toronto, or maybe even in Montreal. Many of the Palestinian Canadians are not actually refugees. They are immigrants. They immigrated from Palestine. Where you can find Palestinian refugees or descendants of is in the States or in Latin America. So I wouldn't have an answer for the Palestinians here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. No matter how scarce the presence is, I was wondering, there would have been a movement of awareness or some political statements or some artistic, I don't know, installations or reactions or whatever. I mean,
you do have solidarity protests. Some happen in Toronto recently, and you do have a lot of Palestinian Canadian poets. For example, Rafif Ziada, who actually worked as a journalist during the 2008 airstrikes on Gaza. So she's done a few spoken word albums, and she's based out of Ontario as well, I think.
that's great. Could you please write his name in the chat, so I will have the spelling?
Yeah.
Great,
I've
thanks.
taught poetry in my classes before, Ralia. She's great. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rawia. Sanem, you are up next.
Thank you. Great papers. Thank you all very, very much. I have one question that is going to play the devil's advocate, but I will leave that for now. And I want to say something about Steve's paper, which I liked a lot because of how you kind of like break down the boundaries between the human and the non-human, and it's not only between the human and the animal, but also bringing in the plants. And I really loved the octopus there, as you can imagine, in the Netflix series. So I'm wondering if we can, if we want to not classify, but maybe put a different kind of emphasis on what it means to be living on this earth and inhabiting the earth as a matter of differential movement, right? Because it seems to me that that's what you're talking about. It is, it's like through walking, and it is running away, but then also carrying things and how plants are getting carried. So, I mean, this is one concept that I think that for me that emerges from your talk is the idea of the differential movement. And And I wonder if that is like, if we want to look at Rawia's and Alessandra's papers from the perspective of the differential movement, I wonder where we're going to go. Because one of the things that I do, and I do not want to be unfair, this is the part when I'm being the devil's advocate, is that I wonder if there is some kind of a new normalization of land and home, or dwelling as the land itself. Because the way that we define, and Alessandra, I think that you have complicated it perfectly, that this is not a matter of only displacement, but this is also a matter of like seeking happiness, or like being the subject of enunciation. And I think that we have something there. But on the other hand, when it is a matter of like finding laws that will enable the workers from Africa to go back and forth, and the way that they love their countries, or for Rawia, for you, the case that this is all a matter of returning to the homeland. Is it making the homeland, or is it making the land itself the home? And what if we are able to find different sources of dwelling everywhere in the world, if it's a matter of, as Steve was putting forward, a matter of differential movement, and not of coming back and returning, and this dual model. I hope I'm not being unfair, and I hope I'm making sense. Thank you for all the three, again, papers.
Anybody?
No, Sanema, can you explain a bit more what you mean by different sources of dwelling?
What I mean is that, it is, instead of seeing the movement, or instead of like putting, as you're saying, like instead of carrying the language and the discourse of victimization and of dispossession, of dislocation, all of these are negative concepts, and all of these do make us think of a loss, and most probably, as Rawia was putting forward, quoting Lacan, a loss that was never there. So that is why I'm thinking that if we can think of, if home itself is that thing, and if the narrative of returning is precisely returning to somewhere that never was, and in that sense, what if it's a matter of differential dwelling, again, like building on Steve's point, if it is what defines the whole species, or dwelling on this earth as a matter of movement. Is it clear now?
Yeah.
I could jump in just a little bit if you want, and that's, thanks, Anam. That's a really great question. I like what you're honing in on. I would just return very briefly to this gardener and philosopher I was quoting, Gilles Clément, and fascinating how he really focuses on spaces that human beings have been disturbed, like land spaces that have been disturbed by human beings, which is much of the planet, because that's what invasive seeds need to grow in. They don't grow in hard, untouched ground. They prefer ground that's been disturbed and dug up. And so he refers to these as undocumented tracts. So the language of like an undocumented human being, he transfers onto the land itself as being undocumented land. And that's really kind of a fascinating flip he makes of those things. So, his whole idea is that everything's mobile. All tracks have become undocumented. How do we collaborate with all these other mobile species in working with who we are, where we are? That's a pretty broad and vague summary, but I think that's where he's going that I find so fascinating. So he would be, he doesn't like the idea of an indigenous species, for instance. He thinks that that's wrong-headed to start thinking that way. Because most species, and especially because of human beings going over in the world and taking all these seeds with us, intentionally and unintentionally, we've shuffled the deck so radically that the concept doesn't really mean a lot anymore.
Do we have time for one more question, or do Alexandra or Rawia want to tackle Sanem's?
It is a really provocative question. I'm not sure how really to tackle it. I would need to give it some more thought in the way in which the differential comes into place. Why don't we go to the next question? Perhaps thinking more, we can come back to it. Unless Ravia, you want to jump in now.
Let me think about it.
Okay, Hilda Fernandez,
Yes,
last
thank
question
you.
for today.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talks. My question, it's more directed to Ravia and Alessandra in terms of the reflections that you pose in terms of more like a social dimension or a scale, and the contrast with the trauma that occurs at the individual level or at the subject level. Because, for example, there's a big discussion about victimhood in terms of whether or not it's something that allows some healing, let's say in the individual or in the community, because on the one hand, legitimize the suffering, legitimize the demands, allows them to get some sort of benefits that are deserved, given the kind of the injury that they suffer. On the other hand, we know that it's an identity that can prevent to move into a different thing. But it's at the very level of the individual is a very difficult question, because it's once that you are injured in such a traumatic way, in such a deep kind of profound thing of your dignity. It's something that is almost like a way of maintaining certain resiliency. So there's a lot of discussions about that in trauma studies, and I was thinking, well, it's almost like people to pass the horrific sense of loss or whatever, they have to engage with for example, what Ragua was mentioning, sublimation, or this transference of memory, even if it doesn't have any restitution. For example, the beautiful example of the keys, right? Maybe it's all about maintaining alive a memory that there's some dispossession. Obviously, it leaves out the bigger question of whether or not the solution of trauma, it's a matter of political restitution, right? Like a just restitution. But I just wanted to bring this just into the thing. Another question is that when we said-
we have 2 minutes left.
I know, yeah. When we said they lost what was never there, it still is a loss. It still is a loss, because we always have a space for what is not there, and that is already taken. So just wanted to put that.
Thanks, Hilda. If I can say something very quickly, I think it speaks also to the impossibility of reconciling fully the social in terms of the social, or let's say the larger community or a public discourse or a political discourse, with the dimension of the individual. Obviously, they're all interconnected with a social bond. It goes without saying. But I don't think the temporality can be the same. There is something about the traumatic experience that also needs a different pace, and perhaps a different dwelling. Maybe coming back to Sanem, a different dwelling also in that sense.
I think why I was interested in the idea of return, particularly for second or third generation Palestinian refugees, is that they are told they lost this place, they lost this thing, and they sing about it, tell stories, and it's very much part of their being. Yet that, and they do get that intergenerational trauma as well, but that trauma is never actually fully realized until they see Palestine, to see what it is. Without seeing Palestine, all they think of is this, like Barghouti, all he thinks of is this magical place that we lost and we have to keep trying to get it back. But they never realize that it's just a place like any other place in the world. And I think that moment, or that confrontation with the supposed lost object, is necessary for them to try to begin to heal from that trauma. They must, in a way, go back to the scene of the trauma.
Can I say something here? Because you mentioned
we're out of time, Alessandra.
Oh, okay.
I was told by the big other, and I just want to introduce Irene Kotsavilli, who was one of the organizers, to wrap it up at 6:15, and she has a few words to say.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. A virtual round of applause for the presenters of this panel and all the panels. Thank you very, very much. Alessandra Capradani, James Horncastle, and I, Irene Kotsavilli, the organizers of this event, would like to thank you all for joining us. I begin with our moderators from SFU and Douglas College, Clint Burnham, Shuyu Kong, Julian Brooks, our presenters from different departments at SFU, Paul Kroll, Lauren Faulkner-Rossi, Stephen Bozanich, Stephen Collis, and Raya Enaim, for the presentations, the insightful contributions and reflections on the theme of migration, with references to current events, theory, politics, cultural production, and world history. And our audience members for all the questions that you shared with us. The symposium would not have been possible without the support received from the Humanities Department, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies, and the Institute for Humanities at Simon Fraser University. Our thanks go to the chair of the Humanities Department, Professor David Merhadi, the director of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies, Professor Dimitri Kralis, the administrative coordinator of the center, Lauren Gilbert. Lauren, thank you. The director of the Institute for Humanities and associate professor, Samir Gandesha, and the program assistant of the Institute, Huyen Pham. We invite you to join us all tomorrow at 9:30 using the same link for our first panel on migration and politics, moderated by Sanem Guvench from the Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and presentations from Samir Gandesha from the Department of Humanities, Jamil Kader from the Department of English at Bethlehem University, and Eldon Yellowhorn from the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. That wraps up. Thank you so much. See you all tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.